Broken ranch dreams. Delilah Del Callahan had sworn never to trust a man again, but when she found herself stranded with Rhett Slade, a gunfighter with nothing left to lose, she had no choice. He sat by the fire, watching her, his voice low. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." Chapter 1. The Desert's Cruel Embrace. The sun, a molten disk of fire, beat down upon the cracked earth, baking the already parched landscape to a brittle crisp. Delilah Del Callahan squinted, her eyes, the color of faded denim, tracing the horizon where the heat shimmered, blurring the line between earth and sky. The stagecoach, or rather, the wreckage of it, lay scattered around her like discarded toys, a testament to the bandit attack that had left her stranded, alone, and utterly vulnerable. Her throat was raw, her lips cracked, and a film of dust coated everything, clinging to the sweat on her skin. She'd been traveling from San Antonio to Silver Creek, a fledgling town clinging to the edge of civilization, a place where she hoped to outrun the ghosts of her past and build a new life. A life free from the suffocating expectations of her family, free from the memory of him. But the desert, it seemed, had other plans. The attack had been swift, brutal. The screams of the other passengers still echoed in her ears, mingling with the roar of the departing horses and the triumphant whoops of the outlaws. She'd survived by playing dead, lying face down in the dirt, the metallic tang of blood filling her nostrils. A coward's tactic, perhaps, but Del had learned long ago that survival often demanded the sacrifice of pride. Now, hours later, the silence was almost as deafening as the chaos that had preceded it. Vultures circled lazily overhead, their black silhouettes stark against the blinding blue. Del knew she had to move, to find water, shelter, anything. But fear, cold and clammy, held her rooted to the spot. Every rustle of the wind, every scuttling lizard, sounded like the approach of danger. She forced herself to her feet, her legs shaky, her body protesting with a chorus of aches and pains. Her once fine traveling dress, now ripped and stained, offered little protection from the elements. She surveyed the wreckage, her heart sinking. The water barrels were smashed, their contents long since absorbed by the thirsty ground. The strongbox, containing what little money she had left, was gone. Hope, a fragile butterfly, fluttered weakly within her chest. She had to try. She had to believe that there was a chance, however slim. She began to walk, her steps slow and deliberate, heading west, towards the distant, hazy outline of mountains. She walked until her feet were blistered and bleeding, until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, crimson, and violet. It was then that she saw him. He emerged from the deepening shadows, a silhouette against the fading light, riding a magnificent black stallion that seemed to blend seamlessly with the twilight. He was tall, lean, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous power. As he drew closer, Del could make out the details. A weathered face, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and resilience, eyes that were dark and intense, a gun belt slung low on his hips, the handle of the revolver glinting ominously. He reined in his horse a few feet away, the animal snorting and pawing the ground. Del's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was no rescuer. This was something else entirely. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, assessing. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, filled only with the soft whisper of the wind and the rhythmic breathing of the horse. Del found herself unable to speak, unable to move, trapped in the intensity of his stare. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're a long way from anywhere, Mississippi." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Del swallowed, her throat dry and tight. The stage it was attacked. He nodded, his eyes flicking to the wreckage in the distance. "I saw." Another silence. Del waited, her breath caught in her chest. She had to be careful. One wrong word, one wrong move could be fatal. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, back in San Antonio. Back with him. I need help, she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, the spurs on his boots jingling softly. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, and Dell felt a primal urge to flee. But there was nowhere to run. The desert stretched out around them, vast and unforgiving, offering no escape. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and gunpowder, a scent that both terrified and, strangely, intrigued her. He was even taller than she'd realized, his presence overwhelming. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Help comes at a price, miss," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Everything does out here." Dell's hand instinctively went to the small, silver locket she wore around her neck, a hidden keepsake, a memento from a life she had been so desperate to be rid of. It was the only thing of value she had left. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. "I have nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They took everything." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something amusement? Contempt? Crossing his face. "Nothing?" He reached out, his fingers brushing against the locket. Dell flinched, but he didn't pull away. "This looks like something." It's not worth much," she stammered, her heart pounding. "It's just sentimental." He continued to hold the locket gently between his fingers as he gazed down at it. He looked from the locket, back at Dell, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Sentimental value can be worth more than gold, miss," he said softly. "Especially out here, where there's so little of it left." He released the locket, and Dell felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with a lingering fear. She didn't know who this man was, what he wanted, but she knew one thing. She was at his mercy. He turned and walked back to his horse, retrieving a canteen from his saddlebag. He offered it to her, and Dell hesitated for a moment, her thirst warring with her distrust. But the dryness in her throat was overwhelming, and she finally took it, drinking deeply. The water was cool and surprisingly sweet, a balm to her parched throat. She handed the canteen back, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on her. "I'm Rhett Slade," he said. Dell hesitated, then offered her own name, Delilah Callahan. "But everyone calls me Dell." He studied her, his dark eyes still filled with an unsettling knowing. "Dell," he repeated, the name sounding different on his tongue, somehow more intimate. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." He gestured with his head to the setting sun. Night falls quickly, and the desert grows cold. What was she going to do? Where would she go? Dell looked around the vast, unforgiving landscape, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. A decision had to be made. Now. Chapter 2. A Stranger's Offer, a Wary Heart. The last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the desert floor. The air, which had been stiflingly hot just moments before, began to cool rapidly, a stark reminder of the desert's capricious nature. Dell shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, her thin, torn dress offering little protection against the encroaching chill. Rhett Slade watched her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He seemed unfazed by the temperature change, his lean frame radiating a sense of self-sufficiency that Dell envied. He'd built a small fire, the flames flickering merrily, casting a warm, inviting glow. It was a beacon in the growing darkness, a symbol of survival. "Come closer to the fire, Dell," he said, his voice low and soothing, like the crackle of the burning wood. Dell hesitated. Trusting this man, this stranger with a gun and eyes that seemed to see right through her, felt like a reckless gamble. But the alternative, spending the night alone in the cold, exposed to the dangers of the desert, was even more terrifying. She took a tentative step towards the fire, then another, until she was close enough to feel the warmth on her skin. He'd spread a bedroll near the fire, a simple, utilitarian affair. He gestured towards it. "Seat. You look like you're about to collapse." Dell sank gratefully onto the bedroll, her body aching with exhaustion. She watched as he moved around the fire, his movements economical and efficient. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, a man comfortable in this harsh environment. He pulled a tin cup and a small, blackened pot from his saddlebags. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up the pot. Del nodded, surprised. "Yes, please." He poured the steaming liquid into the cup and handed it to her. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She cupped the tin in her hands, savoring the warmth, the simple comfort of it. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. Del stole glances at Rhett, trying to decipher the enigma that he was. He was a hard man. She could see that, a product of this unforgiving land. But there was something else there, too, a hint of something deeper, hidden beneath the surface. "Why are you out here?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Running," he said simply. "From what?" He shrugged, a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his shoulders. "The law." "Mostly." Del's heart skipped a beat. An outlaw. She'd known it, sensed it from the moment she'd seen him. And yet, she wasn't running. She was sitting here, sharing his fire, drinking his coffee. "And you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "What brings a woman like you to this godforsaken place?" Del hesitated. She'd been running too, running from a past she couldn't escape, from a man who had broken her heart and shattered her trust. But she couldn't tell him that. She couldn't reveal her vulnerability to this stranger. I was going to Silver Creek," she said, choosing her words carefully. "To start a new life." "Silver Creek," he repeated, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "That's a rough town. Not exactly a place for a lady." "I'm not a lady," Del said, a touch of defiance in her voice. "Not anymore." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her further. He seemed to understand, to accept her unspoken truth. They ate a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack, sharing the meager rations in silence. The food was tasteless, but Del was grateful for it. It filled the emptiness in her stomach, gave her a semblance of strength. As the night deepened, the fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on their faces. Del found herself strangely drawn to Rhett, despite her fear, despite her better judgment. There was a magnetism about him, a raw, untamed energy that both frightened and fascinated her. "You said help comes at a price," she said, her voice barely a whisper. What price do you expect?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense in the firelight. "I haven't decided yet," he said slowly. "Depends on what kind of help you need." Del felt a shiver run down her spine. His words were ambiguous, unsettling. She didn't know what he meant, what he wanted. I need to get to Silver Creek," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That's all." "That's all?" he repeated, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Silver Creek is a long ride. Dangerous, too. Especially for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," she said, meeting his gaze. "Not anymore." He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then he nodded. "I'll take you to Silver Creek," he said. "But you'll owe me." "And I always collect my debts." Del's heart pounded in her chest. She'd just made a pact with an outlaw, a man she barely knew, a man who could very well be her doom. But she had no choice. She was desperate. And in the desolate landscape of the desert, desperation often outweighed caution. He looked at her, and a slow smile spread across his lips. "Don't look so worried, Del," Rhett said softly, the fire reflecting warm hues across his face. "I'm a man of my word. I protect what's mine. For now, you need my protection, and I've given you my oath. We have a long ride ahead of us." He stood and turned away to tend the dying fire. Chapter 3. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. Sleep eluded Del. Despite the exhaustion that weighed down her limbs, her mind raced, replaying the events of the day, the attack, the encounter with Rhett. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, reddish glow on Rhett's sleeping form. He lay on his back, one arm flung across his eyes, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. Even in sleep, he exuded an aura of danger, a sense of coiled energy ready to spring. Dell sat huddled in her bedroll, staring up at the vast, star-studded sky. The desert night was breathtakingly beautiful, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of the day. Millions of stars glittered like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth, a celestial tapestry that dwarfed her earthly concerns. She'd never seen so many stars, the city lights of San Antonio having always obscured the full glory of the night sky. The silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the embers and the distant howl of a coyote, was both comforting and unsettling. It gave her space to think, to reflect, but it also amplified her sense of isolation, her vulnerability. She thought of her father, a stern, unyielding man who had ruled his family with an iron fist. He'd disapproved of her independent spirit, her desire to break free from the constraints of her prescribed role. He'd wanted her to marry well, to secure the family's social standing. He'd chosen a husband for her, a wealthy, influential man, old enough to be her father. And she had almost gone through with. Almost. The memory of him, of Edward, still had the power to make her stomach churn. He'd been charming at first, outwardly respectful, showering her with gifts and attention. But beneath the veneer of sophistication, there had been a coldness, a cruelty that had slowly revealed itself. He'd wanted to possess her, to control her, to mold her into the perfect society wife. The final straw had been the night he'd tried to force himself on her, his touch rough and demanding, his eyes devoid of any affection. She'd fought him off, scratching, kicking, screaming, until he'd finally relented, his face contorted with anger and frustration. That night, she'd fled, leaving behind everything she'd ever known, running towards an uncertain future. A sudden noise startled her, pulling her back to the present. Rhett stirred, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. He sat up, his eyes alert, scanning the darkness. "What is it?" Dell whispered, her heart pounding. He held up a hand, silencing her. He listened intently for a moment, then relaxed, his body losing its tension. "Just a coyote," he said, his voice low. "Go back to sleep." But Dell couldn't sleep. The memory of Edward's touch, the fear she'd felt, lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder of her past trauma. She felt exposed, vulnerable, even with Rhett nearby. He seemed to sense her unease. He turned to her, his eyes softening in the faint glow of the embers. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Dell shook her head. "Nightmares," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, understanding. "The desert breeds them," he said. "The past has a way of catching up with you out here." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, dented flask. He unscrewed the cap and took a long swig, then offered it to her. "Whiskey," he said. "Helps to quiet the ghosts." Dell hesitated. She'd never been much of a drinker, but tonight, she felt a desperate need for something to numb the fear, to silence the memories. She took the flask and took a small sip, the fiery liquid burning its way down her throat. They passed the flask back and forth in silence, the shared ritual creating a strange sense of intimacy. The whiskey warmed her, loosened her tongue. "What about you?" she asked, her voice bolder now. "What ghosts are you running from?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and shadowed. He hesitated for a moment, then took another swig from the flask. "A woman," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And a bullet." He didn't elaborate, and Dell didn't press him. She understood. She knew what it was like to be haunted by the past, by lost love, by betrayal. She'd felt it before, during her recurring dreams. The image of a woman, blurred, but always with piercing blue eyes. Then, darkness and gunfire. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the dying embers and the shared rhythm of their breathing. The whiskey had dulled the edges of her fear, replaced it with a hazy sense of melancholy. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Rhett stood up, stretching his long limbs. "Time to move," he said. "We have a long way to go." Dell nodded, feeling a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She was still wary of Rhett, still unsure of his motives, but she was also grateful for his presence, for his strength. She knew she couldn't survive alone in this unforgiving land. She needed him, and that thought, more than anything, terrified her. He began to saddle his horse. Dell went to follow, but she paused as Rhett looked up at her, concerned. "You all right, Dell?" Rhett asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "You look pale." Dell bit back a retort, reminding herself she needed this man. He was her only hope now. She simply nodded, but as she turned away, the first hint of light had revealed enough. Rhett had seen the haunting in her eyes, the memory of her own nightmares, etched on her face. Chapter 4. The Dance of Trust and Deception. The journey to Silver Creek was arduous, a relentless test of endurance. The days were scorching, the nights frigid, and the landscape offered little respite. Dell, accustomed to a more comfortable life, struggled to keep up with Rhett's relentless pace. He was a man of few words, his actions speaking louder than any pronouncements. He seemed to anticipate her needs, offering her water before she asked, sharing his meager rations without complaint, adjusting his pace to accommodate her limitations, though he never coddled her. Dell, in turn, tried to be as little burden as possible. She learned to ride, her initial awkwardness gradually giving way to a grudging competence. She helped with the camp chores, gathering firewood, tending the horses, even attempting to cook, with mixed results. They spoke little, their conversations mostly practical, focused on the immediate necessities of survival. But beneath the surface of their interactions, a subtle dance was taking place, a dance of trust and deception, of guarded curiosity and unspoken attraction. Dell found herself increasingly drawn to Rhett, despite her initial fear and distrust. She admired his strength, his resilience, his quiet competence. She saw glimpses of a gentler side, a vulnerability that he tried to hide, a hint of loneliness that mirrored her own. She noticed the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes lingering on her face, her hair, the curve of her neck. She felt the warmth of his hand when he helped her dismount, the accidental brush of his arm against hers as they sat by the fire. These small, seemingly insignificant moments sent a shiver through her, a flutter of something she hadn't felt in a long time. But she was also wary. She knew he was an outlaw, a man with a dark past. She didn't know his true motives, his ultimate intentions. She couldn't afford to trust him completely, not yet. One evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing a meager meal of roasted rabbit, Dell decided to test the waters. "You said you were running from the law," she said, her voice casual, as if it were a matter of little consequence. "What did you do?" Rhett looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the firelight. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "I killed a man," he said simply. Dell's breath caught in her throat. She'd known he was dangerous, but hearing him admit to murder, even in such a matter-of-fact way, sent a chill down her spine. "Was it self-defense?" she asked, hoping against hope that it was. He shook his head. "Not exactly." He didn't elaborate, and Dell didn't press him. She didn't want to know the details, didn't want to hear the story that would undoubtedly shatter the fragile image she was beginning to build of him. But she couldn't help but wonder, what had driven him to kill? What kind of man was he really? The next day, they encountered a small, isolated homestead, a cluster of weathered buildings clinging precariously to the edge of a dry creek bed. A woman, her face etched with hardship, stood on the porch, watching their approach with wary eyes. A young boy, no older than 8, clung to her skirts, his eyes wide with curiosity. Rhett reined in his horse, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "We mean you no harm," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "We just need water." The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking between Rhett and Dell. She seemed to recognize the danger that Rhett represented, but she also saw the exhaustion in Dell's face, the desperation in her eyes. "Come down," she said finally, her voice guarded. "But be quick about it." They dismounted and followed the woman to a well, where they gratefully filled their canteens. Dell offered the woman a small, silver button from her dress, a token of her appreciation. The woman accepted it with a nod, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. As they were preparing to leave, the young boy, who had been watching them with silent fascination, suddenly spoke. "Are you an outlaw, mister?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Rhett smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less hardened. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm also a friend to those in need." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, wooden carving of a horse. He handed it to the boy, who took it with wide, delighted eyes. "Thank you, mister," he said, clutching the carving tightly. As they rode away, Dell looked back at the homestead, at the woman and the boy, their faces etched with gratitude. She saw a different side of Rhett that day, a side that hinted at a capacity for kindness, for compassion. It made her question her assumptions, her fears. It made her wonder if she could trust him, after all. But as they rode further, she caught him looking back as well. His eyes, she realized, were filled with the same sadness she often felt, the same lingering fear. But of what? Chapter 5. Beneath a sky of broken promises. The sky above was a vast, endless expanse of blue, mirroring the boundless desert that stretched out before them. But even under such a seemingly infinite sky, Dell felt a growing sense of confinement, a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with the physical hardships of the journey. It was the unspoken tension between her and Rhett, the constant push and pull of attraction and distrust that was wearing her down. They rode in silence for hours, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Dell stole glances at Rhett, his profile etched against the bright sky, his jaw tight, his eyes focused on the horizon. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his usual guarded demeanor amplified by a brooding intensity. She wondered what he was thinking, what demons he was battling. She wanted to reach out to him, to bridge the gap that separated them, but she didn't know how. She was afraid of shattering the fragile truce they had established, of revealing too much of herself, of making herself vulnerable. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, they came across a small, abandoned shack, its weathered walls leaning precariously, its roof partially collapsed. It was a desolate, forlorn place, a testament to broken dreams and abandoned hopes. "We'll camp here tonight," Rhett said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Dell nodded, feeling a sense of unease settle over her. The shack seemed to exude an aura of sadness, of past tragedies. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that the ghosts of those who had once lived here were watching them, their silent presence adding to the oppressive atmosphere. They unsaddled the horses and gathered firewood, their movements mechanical, their silence amplifying the growing tension between them. Dell tried to start a conversation, to break the heavy silence, but Rhett's responses were curt, monosyllabic. He seemed to have retreated into himself, his walls higher and thicker than ever. As they sat by the fire, eating a silent meal of dried meat and hardtack, Dell couldn't take it anymore. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "You've been like this all day." Rhett looked at her, his eyes dark and troubled. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "About the past. About things I can't change." Dell felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to be haunted by the past, to be weighed down by regrets. "We all have things we regret," she said softly. "Things we wish we could undo." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Some things can't be forgiven," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Some mistakes, they follow you. They mark you." Dell reached out and touched his hand, a spontaneous gesture of comfort. His skin was warm and rough, calloused from years of hard living. He flinched slightly at her touch, but he didn't pull away. "Maybe," she said, her voice gentle. "But we can't let the past define us. We have to keep moving forward. We have to find a way to forgive ourselves." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Is that what you've done?" he asked. "Forgiven yourself?" Dell hesitated. She hadn't forgiven herself, not entirely. She still carried the guilt of her past mistakes, the shame of her near marriage to Edward, the fear that she was somehow damaged, incapable of true love. "I'm trying," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Then, he gently squeezed her hand, a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding. "Me too," he said softly. The simple touch, the shared admission of vulnerability, broke down the barriers between them. Dell felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a growing sense of connection to this complicated, troubled man. That night, as they lay in their bedrolls, the silence was different. It wasn't the oppressive, heavy silence of earlier in the day. It was a comfortable silence, a shared silence, filled with a sense of intimacy and understanding. As Dell drifted to sleep, a whisper escaped her lips. "Rhett?" He answered immediately, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "Yeah, Dell?" "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer, but she felt him shift closer in the darkness. A broken sky, for broken souls. But perhaps, she thought as she drifted to sleep, not entirely broken. Chapter 6. Whispers of a Forgotten Past. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the air carrying the scent of sage and dust. The oppressive atmosphere of the previous night had dissipated, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Rhett seemed more relaxed, his usual guarded demeanor softened by a hint of openness. They packed up their camp in companionable silence, their movements synchronized by days of shared routine. As they were saddling the horses, Dell noticed a small, intricately carved wooden box tucked away in Rhett's saddlebag. It was old, its surface worn smooth by time and handling, a single, faded blue flower painted on its lid. "What's that?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Rhett hesitated, his hand hovering over the box. He seemed reluctant to open it, to reveal its contents. "Just something from the past," he said evasively. Dell didn't press him, but her curiosity grew. The box seemed to hold a significance for him, a connection to a part of his life he kept hidden. They rode for several hours, the landscape slowly changing from barren desert to rolling hills dotted with scrubby trees. The air grew slightly cooler, and the occasional glimpse of green offered a welcome respite from the monotonous brown. As they stopped to rest by a small, trickling stream, Rhett finally opened the wooden box. Dell, pretending to busy herself with watering the horses, stole glances at him, her heart pounding with anticipation. He carefully lifted the lid, revealing a collection of small, treasured objects, a faded photograph of a beautiful woman with laughing eyes and dark, flowing hair, a delicate silver chain with a broken clasp, a lock of dark hair tied with a faded blue ribbon, a small, worn leather-bound book. Dell recognized the woman in the photograph. It was the same woman from her recurring dream, the woman with the piercing blue eyes. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a sense of unreality. Rhett, oblivious to her inner turmoil, picked up the photograph, his fingers tracing the woman's face with a tenderness that made Dell's heart ache. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion.
"She was everything to me."
He didn't say more, but Dell understood. She knew the pain of lost love, the emptiness that it left behind. He carefully placed the photograph back in the box and picked up the leather-bound book. He opened it, revealing pages filled with elegant, flowing handwriting. "She wrote poetry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She saw beauty in everything, even in this harsh land." He began to read, his voice low and resonant, the words painting a vivid picture of the desert landscape, of the love he had shared with Sarah, of the dreams they had woven together. Dell listened, mesmerized, her heart aching for Rhett, for Sarah, for the lost love that echoed through the years. She felt a profound connection to this woman she had never met, a kinship forged by shared pain and unspoken understanding. As Rhett finished reading, he closed the book, his eyes filled with tears. He looked at Dell, his gaze searching hers. "She was killed," he said, his voice raw with emotion. By the same man I killed. Dell gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the fragmented memories of her dream, the whispers of a forgotten past, coalescing into a coherent, horrifying picture. The man Edward, Rhett continued, his voice trembling. He wanted her, but she refused him. He couldn't stand to be rejected. Dell's blood ran cold. Edward. The same name, the same cruelty, the same possessiveness. It couldn't be a coincidence. My Edward, he was from San Antonio, she whispered, her voice shaking. He was cruel. She couldn't finish the sentence, the memory too painful to articulate. But Rhett understood. He saw the pain in her eyes, the fear that still haunted her. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. It's the same man, he said, his voice filled with a quiet rage. Edward Caldwell. He was my brother. Dell stared at him, her mind reeling. Brothers. Rhett and Edward. Two sides of the same coin, one good, one evil. A tangled web of love, betrayal, and vengeance, spanning years and stretching across the vast expanse of the desert. The stream continued to flow, and with it, so many secrets were rushing to the surface. Chapter 7. The Sheriff's Shadow, the Outlaw's Grip. The revelation that Rhett and Edward were brothers hung heavy in the air, a suffocating cloud of shared pain and unresolved conflict. Dell felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, the familiar landscape suddenly alien and treacherous. The man she had been cautiously learning to trust, the man she had felt a growing connection to, was inextricably linked to the man who had caused her so much pain. They rode in silence for the rest of the day, the unspoken truth a barrier between them. Dell struggled to reconcile the image of Rhett, the stoic, protective outlaw, with the knowledge that he was the brother of the cruel, possessive Edward. It was a cognitive dissonance that made her head spin, her heart ache. As dusk began to settle, they approached the outskirts of Silver Creek. The town, a cluster of ramshackle buildings huddled around a dusty main street, looked even rougher and more lawless than Dell had imagined. Saloons blared raucous music, and the air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and something dangerous. Rhett reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the town with a wary intensity. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This town has a long memory, and the sheriff, he's not a man to be trifled with." Dell nodded, her heart pounding. She felt a sense of foreboding, a premonition of trouble. She had come to Silver Creek seeking a new life, a fresh start, but she had a sinking feeling that she had stumbled into something far more complicated, far more dangerous than she had bargained for. They rode slowly down the main street, attracting curious stares from the townsfolk. Dell could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging. She kept her gaze fixed on Rhett's back, drawing strength from his presence, his quiet confidence. They stopped in front of the town's only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure that looked as though it had seen better days. The sign above the door, barely legible, read the Silver Star Hotel. As they dismounted, a tall, imposing figure emerged from the saloon across the street. He wore a star-shaped badge on his chest, and his hand rested on the butt of his revolver. Sheriff Brody. Dell recognized him from Rhett's brief, guarded description. He was a hard man, his face etched with lines of authority and suspicion, his eyes cold and calculating. "Rhett Slade," the sheriff said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "I thought I'd seen the last of you." Rhett nodded, his expression unreadable. "Just passing through, Sheriff." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Dell, his eyes narrowing. "And who's this?" "A traveler," Rhett said, his voice carefully neutral. "She's under my protection." The sheriff's eyes lingered on Dell, his expression skeptical. He seemed to sense the unspoken connection between them, the tension that crackled in the air. "See that she stays out of trouble," the sheriff said, his voice a veiled threat. "I don't want any trouble in my town." He turned and walked back into the saloon, his spurs jingling on the wooden sidewalk. Rhett let out a slow breath, his body relaxing slightly. "He's watching us," he said to Dell, his voice low. "We need to be careful." They checked into the hotel, securing a small, sparsely furnished room on the second floor. The room was clean, but basic, with a narrow bed, a rickety washstand, and a single window overlooking the dusty main street. Dell felt a sense of unease, of confinement. She was trapped not only by the physical limitations of the room, but by the tangled web of past connections and present dangers that surrounded her. Rhett seemed to sense her discomfort. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "We'll be all right," he said, his voice gentle. "I won't let anything happen to you." But Dell wasn't so sure. She had a feeling that the sheriff's shadow and the outlaw's grip were just the beginning of their troubles. She looked out the window, at the bustling street, and a deep feeling settled within. She was no longer just running. She was cornered. Chapter 8. Crossroads of Loyalty and Desire. The Silver Star Hotel, despite its dilapidated exterior, offered a semblance of refuge. The room, though small, was clean, and the bed, though narrow, was surprisingly comfortable. Dell, exhausted from the long journey and the emotional turmoil of the past few days, fell into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with fragmented images of Edward, Sarah, and Rhett, their faces shifting and merging, their voices echoing in a confusing chorus of accusations and pleas. She awoke to the sound of Rhett moving around the room, his movements quiet and efficient. He had already washed and dressed, and he was packing his saddlebags, his expression grim. "Where are you going?" Dell asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I need to take care of some things," he said evasively. "I won't be long." Dell felt a surge of anxiety. She didn't want to be left alone, not in this strange, dangerous town. She had a feeling that Rhett was walking into trouble, and she was afraid of what might happen to him. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, his eyes softening. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers lingering on her skin. "I will," he said softly. "I promise." He left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Dell sat up in bed, feeling a sense of unease settle over her. She had a feeling that this was more than just taking care of things. She knew, instinctively, that it had something to do with Edward, with the past, with the unfinished business that hung between them like a shroud. She got out of bed and dressed, her movements hurried. She couldn't stay here, waiting, wondering. She had to do something. She had to find Rhett. She left the hotel and walked down the main street, her eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk, searching for any sign of Rhett. The town was bustling with activity, miners, ranchers, merchants, and saloon girls mingling in a chaotic dance of commerce and pleasure. She asked around, discreetly inquiring about Rhett, but no one seemed to know anything, or if they did, they weren't willing to talk. She felt a growing sense of frustration, of helplessness. As she was about to give up, she saw a familiar figure emerging from a dark alleyway. It was Rhett, his face pale and drawn, his clothes slightly disheveled. He looked as though he had been in a fight. Dell rushed towards him, her heart pounding. "Rhett, what happened? Are you all right?" He tried to smile, but it was a weak, strained effort. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough. "Just a misunderstanding." But Dell didn't believe him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the tension in his body. She knew something had happened, something bad. She took his arm and led him back to the hotel, her mind racing. She had to get him to safety, to a place where she could tend to his wounds, both physical and emotional. Back in the room, she helped him remove his shirt, revealing a fresh bruise on his ribs and a cut on his arm. She cleaned and bandaged his wounds, her touch gentle and caring. "Tell me what happened," she said, her voice firm. He hesitated, then sighed. "I want to see someone who knew Edward," he said. "Someone who might know where he is." Dell's heart skipped a beat. She had known it. It was about Edward. "And?" she prompted. "He wouldn't talk," Rhett said, his voice filled with frustration. He said Edward was gone. That he'd left Silver Creek months ago." "Gone where?" Dell asked. Rhett shook his head. He didn't know. Or he wouldn't say. Dell felt a surge of disappointment, of despair. She had hoped that they would find Edward here, that they would finally be able to confront him, to get answers, to find some kind of closure. Rhett looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else.
Desire.
He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Dell," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know this isn't what you wanted." Dell leaned into his touch, her body trembling. She was torn between her loyalty to the memory of Sarah, her desire for justice, and her growing feelings for Rhett, the brother of the man she hated. She looked into his eyes, and for a moment, the past, the future, everything faded away. There was only the present, the two of them, caught in a moment of intense connection, of undeniable attraction. The choices were clear. But what was the right path? Dell was more confused than ever. Chapter 9. Scars that time cannot erase. The air in the small hotel room crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of their shared history, their conflicting desires, pressing down on them. Dell felt a magnetic pull towards Rhett, a yearning that transcended logic and reason. She knew it was wrong, that it was dangerous, but she couldn't deny the force of her emotions. Rhett's gaze was intense, his eyes searching hers, questioning, pleading. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her skin, his scent, a mixture of leather, sweat, and something uniquely him, filling her senses. Dell's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed the turmoil within her. She wanted to pull away, to resist, but her body betrayed her. She found herself leaning into him, her lips parting slightly, anticipating his kiss. But just as their lips were about to meet, a knock on the door shattered the moment, pulling them back to reality. Rhett swore under his breath, his body tensing. He moved away from Dell, his expression shifting from desire to guarded caution. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice rough. "Sheriff Brody," came the reply. "Open up." Rhett exchanged a look with Dell, his eyes filled with apprehension. He knew this wasn't a social call. He opened the door, revealing the sheriff standing in the hallway, his face grim, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "I need to ask you some questions, Slade," the sheriff said, his voice cold. "About your brother." Dell's heart sank. She had a feeling that this was going to be bad. Rhett nodded, his expression unreadable.
"Come in, Sheriff."
The sheriff stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the small space, taking in the details. He noticed the bandages on Rhett's arm, the disheveled state of their clothes. "Looks like you've been in a fight," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "It was nothing, Sheriff," Rhett said dismissively. The sheriff ignored him, his gaze shifting to Dell. "And you, Miss Callahan, what's your connection to Edward Caldwell?" Dell felt a chill run down her spine. How did he know about her connection to Edward? I knew him," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "In San Antonio." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Knew him how?" Dell hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't want to implicate herself, but she also didn't want to lie. He courted me," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "But it didn't work out." The sheriff's expression remained skeptical. "And why is that?" Dell took a deep breath. He wasn't a good man," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "He was cruel. He hurt me." The sheriff's gaze lingered on her, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and something else. "Pity?" He turned back to Rhett. "Your brother was a wanted man, Slade," he said. "For murder. For the murder of Sarah Jenkins." Dell gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She hadn't known that Edward was wanted for murder. Rhett's face was pale, his jaw tight. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I believe you know where he is," the sheriff continued, his voice relentless. Rhett shook his head. "I don't. I haven't seen him in years." The sheriff didn't believe him. "I think you're lying, Slade," he said. "I think you're protecting him." He reached for his revolver, his fingers tightening around the handle. "I'm going to give you one more chance," he said, his voice a threat. "Tell me where he is, or I'll take you in." Rhett stood his ground, his eyes locked with the sheriff's. "I told you I don't know," he said, his voice firm. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. Dell felt a surge of fear, not for herself, but for Rhett. She knew he was capable of defending himself, but she also knew that the sheriff was a powerful man, a man with the law on his side. She stepped forward, placing herself between Rhett and the sheriff. "He's telling the truth," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "He doesn't know where Edward is. We've been looking for him too." The sheriff looked at her, his expression softening slightly. He seemed to believe her, or at least, he was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. He lowered his revolver, but his gaze remained fixed on Rhett. "I'm watching you, Slade," he said. "Don't make me regret this." He turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. Rhett let out a long, slow breath, his body relaxing slightly. He looked at Dell, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "It seems I keep owing you my life." Dell's eyes glanced at the door, and then back at Rhett, his shirt still unbuttoned, his wounds visible. She knew he would never show it, but the scars ran deep. Chapter 10. A haven in the heart of the storm. The encounter with Sheriff Brody had left them shaken, the threat of his suspicion hanging over them like a dark cloud. Rhett, despite his outward calm, was visibly on edge, his senses heightened, his movements restless. Dell, too, felt a sense of unease, a premonition of danger that she couldn't shake. "We need to leave Silver Creek," she said, her voice urgent. "It's not safe here." Rhett nodded, his agreement immediate. "I know, but we can't leave tonight. It's too risky. The sheriff will be watching us." They spent the rest of the evening in the small hotel room, their silence punctuated by the sounds of the town outside, the raucous music from the saloons, the occasional shouts and laughter, the constant reminder of the lawlessness that permeated Silver Creek. Dell tried to distract herself by reading Sarah's poetry, the delicate script and heartfelt words a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. She found herself drawn to Sarah's voice, her sensitivity, her ability to find beauty in the harsh landscape of the desert. She felt a kinship with this woman she had never met, a connection forged by shared loss and a shared love for a complicated man. Rhett, meanwhile, paced restlessly around the room, his mind clearly elsewhere. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his internal struggles etched on his face. As darkness fell, they prepared for bed, their movements awkward, their silence heavy with unspoken emotions. The narrow bed, a symbol of their forced intimacy, seemed to amplify the tension between them. Dell lay awake long after Rhett had fallen asleep, her mind racing. She was torn between her growing feelings for him and her fear of the danger he represented, the danger that surrounded them. She knew she couldn't stay with him, that it was too risky, too complicated. But the thought of leaving him, of facing the unknown alone, filled her with a sense of dread. She listened to his breathing, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, a comforting sound in the darkness. She found herself drawn to him, despite her better judgment, despite the warning bells that rang in her head. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers lightly brushing against his skin. He stirred, his hand turning to clasp hers, his grip firm and reassuring. "Dell?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm here," she whispered. He squeezed her hand, his eyes opening slightly, his gaze meeting hers in the darkness. "Don't leave," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Dell's heart ached. She knew she should leave, that it was the only sensible thing to do. But she couldn't.
"Not yet."
"I won't," she promised, her voice trembling slightly. He closed his eyes, his grip tightening on her hand. They fell asleep like that, their hands clasped together, a fragile connection in a world of danger and uncertainty. The next morning, they awoke to a sense of urgency, a shared understanding that they had to leave Silver Creek, and quickly. They packed their belongings, their movements hurried, their silence filled with a sense of purpose. As they were preparing to leave the hotel, a young boy, the same boy who had delivered a cryptic message to Rhett the day before, approached them. "Mr. Slade," he said, his voice hushed. "My pa he sent me. He says he knows where your brother is." Rhett's eyes widened, his body tensing. "Where?" he asked, his voice urgent. The boy hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around. He says he's hiding out at Broken Ridge. But you gotta be careful. He's got men with him. Dangerous men. Broken Ridge. Del knew the name. It was a notorious outlaw hideout, a desolate, treacherous place, a natural fortress that offered protection from the law. Rhett nodded, his expression grim.
Thank you, son, he said.
You've been a great help. He gave the boy a silver coin, a generous reward for the information. As they rode out of Silver Creek, Del felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. They were heading into danger, into the heart of the storm, but they were also heading towards answers, towards a confrontation that had been years in the making. The boy watched them go, his eyes wide. He ran back towards the ramshackle collection of buildings he called home, a feeling of pride and fear swirling within. He'd helped the outlaw, but he also knew, somehow, that he had set something in motion. Something big. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Love. The journey to Broken Ridge was a grueling test of endurance, the landscape growing increasingly harsh and unforgiving. The rolling hills gave way to steep, rocky canyons, the sparse vegetation replaced by jagged cliffs and treacherous ravines. The air was thin and dry, and the sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth to a brittle crisp. Del, despite her growing resilience, struggled to keep up with Rhett's relentless pace. He was driven by a fierce determination, a need for answers, for vengeance, that fueled his every step. He was a man possessed, his focus narrowed to a single, all-consuming goal, finding Edward. Del understood his motivation, his need for closure, but she also feared for him, for his safety. She knew that confronting Edward would be dangerous, that it could cost him his life. She tried to talk to him, to reason with him, but he was deaf to her pleas. He had retreated into himself, his walls higher and thicker than ever, his emotions buried beneath a layer of stoic determination. As they neared Broken Ridge, they came across a small, isolated spring, a tiny oasis in the desolate landscape. They stopped to rest and water the horses, the cool, clear water a welcome respite from the relentless heat. Del sat by the spring, watching Rhett as he tended to the horses. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the lines of strain around his eyes, the tension in his body. She knew he was pushing himself to the limit, driven by a force she couldn't fully comprehend. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle and caring.
Rhett, she said softly.
Please be careful. This is dangerous. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. I have to do this, Del, he said, his voice rough. I have to finish this. Del knew she couldn't stop him, that he was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. But she could offer him her support, her love, her unwavering presence. I know, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm going with you. I won't let you face this alone. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He knew the danger she was putting herself in, the risk she was taking. Del, he began, his voice filled with protest. No, she interrupted, her voice firm. I'm going with you. We're in this together. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Then he nodded, his acceptance a silent acknowledgement of their bond, their shared commitment. As they approached Broken Ridge, the landscape became even more treacherous, the canyons deeper, the cliffs steeper, the sense of danger palpable. They could see the outlaw hideout in the distance, a cluster of ramshackle buildings perched precariously on a high, rocky plateau, a natural fortress that commanded a view of the surrounding terrain. They dismounted and tethered the horses in a hidden ravine, their movements cautious, their senses heightened. They knew they were being watched, that the outlaws were aware of their approach. Rhett drew his revolver, his hand steady, his eyes focused. Stay close to me, he said, his voice low and urgent. And be ready for anything. Del nodded, her heart pounding. She had no weapon, no experience in fighting, but she had courage and she had Rhett. She would face whatever came, alongside him. They began their ascent, the climb arduous, the path treacherous, she felt a growing doubt about herself. Was this courage or foolishness? Chapter 12. Between the law and a hard place. The climb to the outlaw hideout was a grueling test of endurance, the steep, rocky path winding its way up the face of the cliff, offering little purchase. Dell, despite her determination, struggled to keep up with Rhett's relentless pace, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her muscles screaming in protest. Rhett, ever watchful, adjusted his pace to accommodate her, offering her a hand when the terrain became particularly treacherous, his touch both reassuring and protective. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes, conveying a depth of care and concern that belied his stoic exterior. As they neared the top, they heard voices, the rough, guttural tones of the outlaws echoing down the canyon. Rhett signaled Dell to silence, his hand raised in a gesture of caution. They moved slowly, stealthily, using the cover of rocks and scrubby bushes to conceal their approach. They reached the edge of the plateau, peering cautiously over the rim. The outlaw hideout was a collection of ramshackle buildings, a makeshift fortress built from scavenged wood and stone. Several men, armed with rifles and revolvers, were milling around, their faces hard, their eyes watchful. Dell recognized one of the men. It was Edward. He was older, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes still held the same cold, cruel glint that she remembered so vividly. He was talking to another man, a tall, imposing figure with a scar across his face, clearly the leader of the outlaws. Rhett's body tensed, his grip tightening on his revolver. He took a deep breath, his eyes locked on Edward, his expression a mask of controlled fury. "Stay here," he whispered to Dell. "I'll handle this." Dell shook her head, her fear overridden by a fierce determination.
"No."
"I'm with you." Rhett hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He knew he couldn't dissuade her, that she was as determined as he was to see this through. He nodded, his acceptance a silent acknowledgement of their bond, their shared commitment. They moved forward, emerging from their hiding place, their presence immediately drawing the attention of the outlaws. The men stopped talking, their eyes turning towards Rhett and Dell, their hands moving towards their weapons. Edward's eyes widened in surprise, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "Rhett," he said, his voice a sneer. "I should have known you'd come crawling back." Rhett ignored him, his gaze fixed on the leader of the outlaws. "I'm here for my brother," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I want to talk to him." "Alone." The leader of the outlaws, a man known as Scarface Jackson, laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands, Slade?"
he said.
"You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're in no position to bargain." Rhett's expression didn't change.
"I'm not bargaining," he said.
"I'm giving you a choice. Let me talk to my brother, or face the consequences." Scarface Jackson's eyes narrowed, his hand hovering over his revolver. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating the odds. "You're bluffing, Slade," he said. "You wouldn't risk your life for that pathetic excuse for a brother." But his confidence was wavering. Rhett drew a very small, almost imperceptible knife from his boot, the sunlight reflecting briefly from the metal. He moved it with expert precision, making sure only Jackson saw. It was a warning. "Try me," Rhett said, his voice a low growl. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the canyons. Dell stood beside Rhett, her heart pounding, her body trembling, but her resolve unshaken. She was ready to face whatever came, alongside him. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Rhett's head, embedding itself in the wooden wall of the shack behind him. Everyone turned to look at the source of the shot. It was Sheriff Brody, standing at the edge of the plateau, his rifle still smoking. He was accompanied by several deputies, their weapons drawn. "Hold it right there," the sheriff shouted. "Everyone drop your weapons." The outlaws, caught between Rhett and the sheriff, hesitated, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They were trapped, caught between the law and a hard place, their carefully constructed world collapsing around them. The standoff had reached a breaking point. But in which direction would it break? Chapter 13. Unspoken Truths, Unyielding Bonds. The sudden arrival of Sheriff Brody and his deputies had thrown the already tense situation into chaos. The outlaws, caught between Rhett's unwavering resolve and the sheriff's lawful authority, were a powder keg waiting to explode. Dell, standing beside Rhett, felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and a strange sense of exhilaration. This was it. The culmination of their journey, the moment of reckoning. Rhett, his eyes still fixed on Edward, didn't flinch at the sheriff's arrival. He seemed unfazed by the added complication, his focus narrowed to a single, unwavering point: his brother. Edward, however, looked panicked. His eyes darted between Rhett, the sheriff, and his outlaw companions, his face a mask of fear and desperation. He knew he was cornered, his carefully constructed world of lies and deceit crumbling around him. Slade. The sheriff shouted again, his voice echoing across the plateau. I told you to drop your weapon. You're under arrest. Rhett ignored him, his gaze unwavering. Edward, he said, his voice low and intense. It's over. Tell them the truth. Tell them what you did. Edward hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and defiance. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. Scarface Jackson, sensing an opportunity to shift the blame, stepped forward. He's lying, Sheriff, he shouted. Slade's the one who killed Sarah Jenkins. He's the one you want. Dell gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew it was a lie, a desperate attempt to deflect the blame. But would the sheriff believe it? Rhett didn't react to Jackson's accusation. He remained focused on Edward, his eyes boring into his brother's soul. Tell them, Edward, he repeated, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Tell them the truth. It's the only way to make this right. Edward finally broke. The weight of his guilt, the years of lies and deception, became too much to bear. He collapsed to his knees, his body shaking, his face buried in his hands. I did it, he sobbed. I killed her. I killed Sarah. A collective gasp went through the crowd, the outlaws, the deputies, even Sheriff Brody, stunned by Edward's confession. Dell felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of closure, of justice finally being served. But it was a bittersweet victory, tinged with sadness for the loss of Sarah, for the wasted lives, for the broken bonds of brotherhood. Sheriff Brody, his face grim, stepped forward and placed Edward under arrest. The deputies moved in, disarming the outlaws, their resistance broken by Edward's confession. As Edward was being led away, he looked at Rhett, his eyes filled with remorse and regret. I'm sorry, Rhett, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Rhett didn't reply. He simply watched his brother, his expression unreadable. The years of anger, of hatred, seemed to drain away, replaced by a profound sadness, a sense of loss that went beyond words. The sheriff approached Rhett, his expression softening slightly. You did the right thing, Slade, he said. You brought a killer to justice. Rhett nodded, his gaze still fixed on the receding figure of his brother. It wasn't about justice, Sheriff, he said, his voice low. It was about truth. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plateau, Dell walked over to Rhett and placed a hand on his arm. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. Gratitude. It's over, she said softly. It's finally over. He nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes. They had faced the storm together, and they had emerged, scarred but not broken, their bond strengthened by the shared ordeal. But as Dell looked at him, a lingering doubt began to form. Was it truly over? Or was this just the calm before another, even fiercer storm? Chapter 14. The Reckoning of Lost Souls. With Edward's confession and arrest, a sense of uneasy calm settled over Broken Ridge. The outlaws, their spirit broken, were rounded up and taken into custody, their reign of terror brought to an end. Sheriff Brody, though still wary of Rhett, acknowledged his role in bringing Edward to justice, offering a grudging respect that fell short of trust. Rhett and Dell, exhausted but strangely relieved, were allowed to leave, the sheriff's watchful gaze following them as they descended the treacherous path from the plateau. They retrieved their horses and rode in silence, the weight of the day's events pressing down on them, the unspoken truths and unresolved emotions hanging heavy in the air. As they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, Rhett reined in his horse, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. I need to go, he said, his voice low and hesitant. Dell felt a pang of disappointment, a sense of loss that she couldn't quite explain. She had known this moment would come, that their paths would inevitably diverge, but she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it wouldn't be so soon. Where will you go? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. I don't know. Somewhere, anywhere. I need to find myself. Dell understood. He was a lost soul, haunted by the past, burdened by the weight of his brother's sins. He needed time, space, to heal, to find some kind of peace. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers lingering on his skin. Thank you, Rhett, she said, her voice filled with emotion. For everything. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, questioning, yearning. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her skin, his scent, a mixture of leather, sweat, and something uniquely him, filling her senses. He kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of unspoken desires, of shared pain, of a connection that transcended words. It was a kiss of goodbye, a farewell to a love that could never be, a love born of adversity and destined to remain unfulfilled. Dell responded to his kiss, her heart aching, her body trembling. She knew this was the end, that their paths were diverging, but she couldn't resist the pull of her emotions, the yearning for a connection that had been forged in the crucible of danger and shared loss. When the kiss ended, they looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Goodbye, Dell, he said, his voice hoarse. Goodbye, Rhett, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He turned his horse and rode away, his figure gradually disappearing into the vast expanse of the desert, leaving Dell alone, her heart heavy with a sense of loss, of unfulfilled dreams. She watched him go, her eyes blurring with tears, until he was just a speck on the horizon, a fading memory in the vast, unforgiving landscape. She knew she would never forget him, that he would always hold a special place in her heart, a reminder of a time when she had faced her fears, found her strength, and discovered a love that was as unexpected as it was profound. Dell took a deep breath, turned her own horse towards Silver Creek, and started back. She returned to the hotel, and as she entered, she realized she had no idea what the future held. She sat on the edge of the bed. She had come seeking a new life. But where was she to go now? And what would this new life be? Chapter 15. When the past collides with the present. Dell returned to the Silver Star Hotel, the room feeling empty and desolate without Rhett's presence. The silence, once a comfort, now amplified her loneliness, her uncertainty about the future. She had come to Silver Creek seeking a new beginning, but the events of the past few days had left her adrift, her plans shattered, her heart aching. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the dusty main street, her mind replaying the image of Rhett riding away, his figure disappearing into the vast expanse of the desert. She knew she would never forget him, that he would always hold a special place in her heart, but she also knew that their paths were destined to remain separate, their love a fleeting moment in time, a memory to be cherished but never relived. She tried to focus on the future, on building a new life for herself in Silver Creek, but the task seemed daunting, overwhelming. She had no money, no prospects, no connections. She was alone, a stranger in a strange land, her dreams as fragile as the desert flowers that bloomed briefly after a rare rain. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, a knock on the door startled her. She hesitated, her heart pounding, wondering who it could be. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Sheriff Brody," came the reply. Dell's heart sank. What did he want? Had he changed his mind about Rhett? Was she now a suspect? She opened the door cautiously, revealing the sheriff standing in the hallway, his face grim, his expression unreadable. "Miss Callahan," he said, his voice formal. "I need to talk to you." Dell stepped aside, allowing him to enter the room. She closed the door, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The sheriff looked around the room, his eyes taking in the details, the empty bed, the packed saddlebags, the evidence of Rhett's departure. "He's gone, then," he said, his voice a statement, not a question. Dell nodded, her throat tight.
Yes.
The sheriff turned to face her, his gaze intense. "I know you were involved with him," he said. "I know you helped him." Dell didn't deny it. She couldn't. "I did," she said, her voice firm. "But he didn't kill Sarah. His brother confessed." The sheriff nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I know," he said. "But Slade, he's still an outlaw. He's still a wanted man." Dell felt a surge of anger, of frustration. "He's a good man, Sheriff," she said, her voice rising. "He's not the person you think he is." The sheriff sighed, his gaze shifting to the window, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Maybe," he said, "but the law is the law, and I have a duty to uphold it." He paused, then turned back to Dell, his expression changing, becoming more personal. "But I also believe in second chances," he said. "And I believe in justice. Not just the legal kind, but the human kind." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Dell. "This was found in Edward Caldwell's belongings," he said. "It's a letter, addressed to you." Dell took the letter, her hands trembling. She recognized Edward's handwriting, the elegant, flowing script that had once charmed her, but now filled her with a sense of dread. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the words, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a confession, a detailed account of Edward's crimes, not only the murder of Sarah, but other, darker deeds, crimes that Dell had never known about. But it was the last paragraph that made her gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "I know about your family, Delilah," Edward had written. "I know about your father's debts, your brother's gambling, your mother's illness. I know everything. And I used it all against you. I manipulated you, I controlled you, I almost destroyed you." Dell felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a sense of violation, of being exposed, of having her deepest secrets laid bare. Edward had known everything, had used her vulnerabilities against her, had almost succeeded in breaking her spirit. The sheriff watched her, his expression filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else. Understanding. "He was a monster, Miss Callahan," he said softly. "And you survived him. You're stronger than you think." Dell looked up at the sheriff, her eyes filled with tears. She had never thought of herself as strong, but she had survived, she had endured, she had found the courage to face her fears, to break free from the past. The sheriff smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less hardened. "Silver Creek needs good people, Miss Callahan," he said. "People like you. People who are willing to fight for what's right, to stand up for what they believe in." He paused, then added, "And I think you could find a home here. A new beginning." Dell looked from the letter to the sheriff, her heart heavy. How could everything change, and yet still feel so familiar? Chapter 16. A desperate gamble for redemption. The sheriff's words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Dell, still reeling from the revelations in Edward's letter, felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility in the darkness that had surrounded her. Could she really find a new beginning in Silver Creek, a town that had been the scene of so much pain and turmoil? She looked at Sheriff Brody, his face etched with lines of authority and a surprising hint of compassion. She saw not just a lawman, but a man who understood the complexities of human nature, the blurred lines between right and wrong, the enduring power of redemption. I don't know what to say, Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I have nothing. No money, no prospects." The sheriff nodded, his expression understanding. "I know it won't be easy," he said. "But Silver Creek is a town of opportunities, a place where people can reinvent themselves, start over. He paused, then added, "And I'm willing to help. I can offer you a job, a place to stay. It's not much, but it's a start." Del's heart skipped a beat. A job? A place to stay? It was more than she had dared to hope for. "Well, what kind of job?" she asked, her voice filled with cautious optimism. The sheriff smiled. "The town needs a teacher," he said. "Someone to teach the children, to bring some civilization to this rough and tumble place. And I think you'd be perfect for the job." A teacher. Del had never considered such a possibility. She had always loved books, learning, the power of knowledge to transform lives. She had dreamed of opening a school, of sharing her passion for education with others, but she had always believed that dream to be out of reach. I don't know if I'm qualified," she said, her voice filled with doubt. The sheriff chuckled. "You're more qualified than you think, Miss Callahan," he said. "You've faced more challenges, overcome more obstacles than most people I know. And you have a good heart, a strong spirit. That's all that matters." Del felt a surge of gratitude, of hope, a sense of possibility that she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at the sheriff, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance." The sheriff nodded, his expression softening. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Callahan," he said. "You still have a lot to prove. But I believe in you. And I think you'll make a difference here." He offered her a hand, a gesture of friendship, of support. Del took his hand, her grip firm, her heart filled with a newfound determination. She would make a new life for herself in Silver Creek. She would prove herself worthy of the sheriff's trust. She would build a future that was free from the shadows of the past. As the sheriff left, Del felt a shift within. This was a gamble, a desperate one even. She might fail, but she had a chance. And for the first time in a very long while, Del felt a sense of peace, of purpose, a belief that she could finally find a place to call home, a place where she could heal, grow, and perhaps even find love again. But not with Rhett. That chapter, she knew, was closed. As she looked out the window, a thought crossed her mind. Perhaps I'll write him. Chapter 17. The thin line between vengeance and justice. Del spent the next few days settling into her new life in Silver Creek. Sheriff Brody, true to his word, provided her with a small, sparsely furnished room above the town's general store, a space that was both a refuge and a symbol of her newfound independence. He also helped her secure the position of schoolteacher, introducing her to the townsfolk, vouching for her character, and smoothing the way for her acceptance into the community. The town, initially wary of the newcomer, gradually warmed to Del's quiet strength, her gentle demeanor, and her genuine passion for education. The children, in particular, were drawn to her, their faces lighting up with curiosity and excitement as she introduced them to the wonders of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Del found a sense of purpose in her work, a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. She poured her heart and soul into teaching, creating a classroom that was both a place of learning and a haven of safety and encouragement. She saw the potential in her students, the bright sparks of intelligence and creativity that were waiting to be ignited, and she dedicated herself to nurturing their minds and spirits. But despite her newfound purpose, Del couldn't entirely shake the shadow of the past. The memory of Rhett, his kiss, his parting words, lingered in her mind, a bittersweet reminder of a love that could never be. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he had found the peace he sought. She also couldn't forget Edward's letter, the chilling revelations of his manipulation and control, the deep-seated wounds that he had inflicted upon her. She had forgiven him, in a way, but she could never forget the pain he had caused, the damage he had done. One evening, as Del was grading papers in her room, she heard a commotion outside, the sound of shouting and raised voices. She looked out the window and saw a crowd gathered in front of the saloon, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the lanterns. She recognized Sheriff Brody in the center of the crowd, his face grim, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He was facing a group of men, their faces hard, their eyes filled with anger. Dell recognized them as former members of Scarface Jackson's outlaw gang, men who had escaped capture during the raid on Broken Ridge. They were demanding the release of their comrades, threatening violence if their demands weren't met. The tension in the air was palpable, the threat of violence imminent. Dell felt a surge of fear, not for herself, but for the sheriff, for the town, for the fragile peace that she had begun to build. She knew that these men were dangerous, that they were capable of anything. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. Should she stay in her room, safe and out of harm's way? Or should she intervene, try to defuse the situation, risk her own safety for the sake of others? She knew what Rhett would do. He would stand up to the outlaws, he would fight for what was right, he would protect the innocent. And she knew that she had to do the same. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She left her room and walked down the stairs, her steps firm, her heart pounding. She emerged from the general store and walked towards the crowd, her presence immediately drawing their attention. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the noise of the crowd. The outlaws turned to face her, their eyes filled with surprise and suspicion. They recognized her, the woman who had been with Rhett Slade, the woman who had played a part in their downfall. "Stay out of this, lady," one of the outlaws said, his voice a sneer. "This ain't your fight." Dell stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "It is my fight," she said. "It's everyone's fight. This is about justice, about keeping this town safe." The outlaws scoffed, their faces contorted with anger. "Justice?" one of them said. "You think you know anything about justice? You were with Slade, an outlaw, a killer." Dell didn't flinch. "Rhett Slade is not the man you think he is," she said. "He brought his brother to justice, he helped the sheriff capture your gang. He's done more for this town than any of you." Her words seemed to have an effect, at least on some of the men. They shifted uneasily, their resolve wavering slightly. Sheriff Brody, seeing an opportunity, stepped forward. "She's right," he said. "Slade helped us. He's not your enemy. Your enemy is the past, the life of crime that you chose. It's time to let it go, to move on." But would they listen? The line was thin, and it felt like it was about to break. Chapter 18. Echoes of Love in a Barren Land. The sheriff's words, backed by Dell's unexpected defense of Rhett, hung in the air, a fragile attempt to bridge the chasm of anger and resentment. The outlaws, their faces a mixture of defiance and uncertainty, hesitated, their initial bluster deflating under the weight of reason and the unexpected show of unity between the sheriff and the former outlaw's companion. Dell, standing tall and resolute, felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of empowerment that she hadn't known she possessed. She had faced her fears, stood up for what she believed in, and, perhaps, made a difference. The leader of the outlaws, a man named Lefty because of a missing finger on his right hand, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Dell. "You think you can just waltz in here and tell us what to do?" he said, his voice a growl. "You think you can change who we are?" Dell met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not trying to change who you are," she said. "I'm asking you to choose a different path. A path of peace, of forgiveness, of redemption." Lefty scoffed, his face contorted with anger. "Redemption?" "There's no redemption for us," he said. "We're outlaws, killers. That's all we'll ever be." Dell shook her head. "That's not true," she said. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone can change." Rhett Slade proved that. The mention of Rhett's name seemed to have an unexpected effect on the outlaws. They shifted uneasily, their eyes flickering with a mixture of respect and fear. They knew that Rhett had betrayed his brother, had helped the sheriff, but they also knew that he was a man of his word, a man of honor, in his own way. Sheriff Brody, sensing a shift in the mood, stepped forward again. "He's right," he said. "Slade chose a different path. He chose justice over vengeance. And you can too. You can choose to leave this life behind, to start over." He paused, then added, "I'm offering you amnesty. Surrender your weapons, and I promise you won't be prosecuted for past crimes. You'll be free to go, to start a new life." The outlaws looked at each other, their faces a mixture of disbelief and hope. Amnesty? It was an offer they hadn't expected, a chance to escape the cycle of violence and retribution that had defined their lives. Lefty, his face still hard, but his eyes flickering with uncertainty, hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached for his revolver. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop to the ground, the thud echoing in the silence. The other outlaws followed suit, one by one, surrendering their weapons, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had made a choice, a desperate gamble for a new beginning, a chance to escape the shadows of their past. As the sheriff and his deputies collected the weapons, Dell felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of hope. She had played a part in this, a small part perhaps, but a significant one. She had helped to defuse a potentially violent situation, to bring peace to a troubled town, to offer a glimmer of redemption to lost souls. She looked at the sheriff, his face etched with lines of fatigue but also with a hint of satisfaction. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of her courage, her strength, her unwavering belief in the power of second chances. As the crowd dispersed, Dell returned to her room, her heart filled with a sense of peace, of purpose. She had found a home in Silver Creek, a place where she could make a difference, where she could build a new life, free from the shadows of the past. She sat by the window, looking out at the starry sky, the vast expanse of the desert stretching out before her. She thought of Rhett, wondering where he was, what he was doing. She hoped he had found the peace he sought, the redemption he deserved. She wished that things had turned out differently. Suddenly, she knew she had to write that letter. She began to write, the words pouring out of her. It would be her final goodbye. Chapter 19. The Final Stand at Broken Ridge. Dell sat at the small, rickety table in her room, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows on the walls. She held a pen in her hand, poised above a blank sheet of paper, her mind filled with a jumble of emotions, a mixture of longing, regret, and a profound sense of closure. She was writing to Rhett, a final goodbye, a letter she knew he might never receive, but one she felt compelled to write. She began to pour out her heart, her words flowing freely, unburdened by the constraints of fear and uncertainty that had once held her back. She wrote of her new life in Silver Creek, of her work as a teacher, of the children she was helping to shape, of the community that had embraced her. She wrote of the sheriff's offer of amnesty, of the outlaw's surrender, of the fragile peace that had settled over the town. And she wrote of Rhett, of her gratitude for his protection, his courage, his unwavering sense of honor. She wrote of the kiss they had shared, the unspoken desires that had flickered between them, the love that could never be. She wrote of her forgiveness, both for him and for his brother, of her understanding of the choices he had made, the burdens he carried. As she wrote, she felt a sense of release, a catharsis that washed away the lingering pain and regret, leaving her with a sense of peace, of acceptance. She had faced her demons, confronted her past, and emerged stronger, more resilient, more whole. She finished the letter, her hand trembling slightly, her eyes blurring with tears. She folded the paper carefully, sealing it with a drop of wax, her heart heavy with a sense of finality. She didn't know where to send it, how to reach Rhett, but she trusted that somehow, someday, it would find its way to him. Just as she was about to put the letter away, a sudden commotion outside startled her. She heard shouting, the sound of horses' hooves, the unmistakable crack of gunfire. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She saw a group of riders galloping down the main street, their faces masked, their guns blazing. They were attacking the town, firing indiscriminately at buildings, at people, creating chaos and terror. Dell recognized them. It was Scarface Jackson and a new band of outlaws. He had broken his word. He had betrayed the sheriff's trust, had shattered the fragile peace that had settled over Silver Creek. He had returned to the outlaw ways. Sheriff Brody and his deputies were caught off guard, their numbers few, their defenses weak. They were fighting bravely, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. their situation desperate. Dell felt a surge of anger, of outrage, at Jackson's betrayal, at the violence he was inflicting upon the town, upon the people she had come to care for. She knew she couldn't stand idly by, that she had to do something, anything, to help. She grabbed the letter, her hand trembling, her resolve hardening. She had a choice to make, a decision that could cost her everything. She could stay in her room, safe and out of harm's way, or she could join the fight, risk her life for the sake of others. She knew what Rhett would do. He would fight. He would stand up to the outlaws. He would protect the innocent. And she knew that she had to do the same. She left her room and ran down the stairs, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She emerged from the general store and ran towards the center of the town, towards the sound of the gunfire. She saw Sheriff Brody, his back against the wall of the saloon, his gun blazing, his face grim, his situation desperate. He was surrounded by outlaws, their guns trained on him, their faces filled with malice. Dell knew she had to act fast, that she had to distract the outlaws, give the sheriff a chance to escape. She picked up a rock and threw it at the nearest outlaw, hitting him in the head, knocking him off balance. "Over here, you cowards!" she shouted, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the noise of the battle. "Come and get me." The outlaws turned their attention to her, their faces contorted with anger. They charged towards her, their guns blazing, their intentions clear. Dell ran, dodging bullets, weaving through the chaos, leading the outlaws away from the sheriff, away from the town. She knew she was putting herself in danger, that she might not survive, but she didn't care. She had to protect the people she loved, the town that had become her home. She ran towards the outskirts of town, towards the familiar landscape of the desert, towards the distant silhouette of Broken Ridge. It was a desperate gamble, a final stand, but she was not alone. As the outlaws pursued her, she heard a sound, a familiar sound, the thunder of hooves, and a voice she knew better than any other.
Rhett.
He had come back. Chapter 20. The dawn of a shared tomorrow. The thunder of hooves grew louder, closer, a symphony of hope amidst the cacophony of gunfire and chaos. Dell, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps, dared to look back. It was Rhett, riding like a vengeful spirit, his black stallion a blur of motion against the dusty landscape. He was flanked by several riders, men Dell recognized, former outlaws, the very men who had surrendered their weapons to Sheriff Brody, now armed and fighting alongside Rhett. Lefty, his face a mixture of surprise and recognition, shouted to the pursuing outlaws, "It's Slade." And those turncoats. The outlaws, momentarily stunned by the unexpected arrival of Rhett and his unlikely allies, hesitated, their pursuit faltering. Rhett seized the opportunity, his revolver blazing, his aim unerring. He rode straight into the midst of the outlaws, scattering them like leaves in a storm, his presence a force of nature that turned the tide of the battle. Dell, seeing Rhett, felt a surge of relief, of gratitude, of a love that transcended words and circumstances. He had come back, not for her, not for vengeance, but for the town, for the people he had sworn to protect. He had chosen a different path, a path of redemption, of selfless courage. The former outlaws, fighting alongside Rhett, proved their loyalty, their commitment to a new life, their willingness to stand up for what was right. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a desire for atonement, their skills honed by years of outlaw life, now turned towards a noble cause. The battle raged, the gunfire echoing across the desert, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. Dell, caught in the crossfire, took cover behind a rocky outcrop, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew she was in danger, but she also knew that she was not alone. Rhett, seeing her vulnerability, rode towards her, his eyes filled with concern.
Dell.
"Get out of here," he shouted, his voice urgent. "It's too dangerous." Dell shook her head, her resolve unshaken. "I won't leave you," she shouted back. "I'm with you, no matter what." Rhett hesitated, his eyes searching hers, his heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. He knew he couldn't protect her, that the battle was too fierce, too unpredictable. But he also knew that she wouldn't leave, that she was as committed to this fight as he was. He nodded, his acceptance a silent acknowledgement of their bond, their shared commitment. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and urgent.
And be careful.
The battle reached its climax, the outlaws, outnumbered and outgunned, their forces dwindling, their leader, Scarface Jackson, cornered and desperate. He raised his revolver, aiming at Rhett, his face contorted with hatred and a final, desperate act of vengeance. But before he could pull the trigger, a shot rang out, and Jackson crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless, his reign of terror finally over. The shot had come from Lefty, the former outlaw, his face a mixture of regret and resolve. He had chosen justice over loyalty, redemption over vengeance. With Jackson's death, the remaining outlaws surrendered, their will to fight broken, their spirit crushed. The battle was over, the town saved, the fragile peace restored. As the dust settled, Rhett rode back to Dell, his face etched with lines of fatigue, but also with a sense of relief, of victory. He dismounted and took her in his arms, his embrace tight, his heart pounding against hers. "It's over, Dell," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's finally over." Dell clung to him, her body trembling, her eyes blurring with tears. She had faced her fears, stood up for what she believed in, and survived. And she had found love, not the romantic love she had once dreamed of, but a deeper, more profound love, a love born of shared struggle, of mutual respect, of unwavering commitment. Sheriff Brody, his face grimy with smoke and sweat, but his eyes filled with gratitude, approached them. "Slade," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I owe you an apology. And my thanks. You saved this town." Rhett nodded, his gaze fixed on Dell. "It wasn't just me, Sheriff," he said. "It was all of us. We fought together, for a shared tomorrow." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and gold, a new dawn broke over Silver Creek, a dawn of hope, of peace, of a future where love, justice, and redemption could flourish, even in the heart of a barren land. Dell knew where she was meant to be. And for the first time, looking at Rhett, perhaps a new chapter might just be starting after all. Epilogue. Years passed, and Silver Creek blossomed. Under Dell's gentle guidance, the schoolhouse became a hub of learning and laughter, nurturing a generation of children who grew up with a sense of hope and possibility, far removed from the violence and lawlessness of the past. Dell, no longer a stranger, was a beloved figure in the town, respected for her strength, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to her students. Sheriff Brody, his hair now streaked with silver, remained the steadfast guardian of the town, his authority tempered by wisdom and a deep understanding of human nature. He had learned to trust, to forgive, to see the potential for good even in the most hardened hearts.
Rhett.
His story became a legend, whispered around campfires and in saloons, a tale of an outlaw who found redemption, a man who chose justice over vengeance, love over fear. He didn't disappear into the vast expanse of the desert, as Dell had initially feared. He stayed. He built a ranch a few miles outside of Silver Creek, a modest homestead nestled among the rolling hills, a place where he could find peace, solitude, and a connection to the land. He raised cattle, worked hard, and slowly, gradually, healed the wounds of his past. He and Dell. Their relationship evolved, slowly, organically, from a bond forged in adversity to a deep, enduring love. They married in a simple ceremony in the town square, the entire community gathering to celebrate their union, a testament to the transformative power of love and forgiveness. They had children, a boy and a girl, who grew up strong and free, imbued with their parents' values of courage, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of second chances. The children, named Sarah and Edward, a tribute to the past and a promise for the future. Dell often thought of the letter she had written to Rhett, the final goodbye that had never been sent. She had kept it, tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of a time when she had been lost, afraid, uncertain of her future. But now she no longer needed it. She had found her home, her purpose, her love. One evening, as she and Rhett sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of the desert, painting the sky in hues of orange, crimson, and violet, Del finally shared the story of the letter with Rhett. He listened, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "You don't need to say goodbye, Del," he said softly. "We're together. That's all that matters." Del leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace, of contentment. She had found her place in the world, her home in his arms, her future in their shared tomorrow. The desert, once a symbol of hardship and loneliness, now stretched out before them, a vast, beautiful landscape filled with promise, with hope, with the enduring power of love to conquer all. As they sat in silence, a coyote howled, and another answered. It was not lonely, but harmonious, a duet under a vast and starry sky. It was a good life. A hard life, but a good one. The end.